evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. Imagine you went to school with Sandy Cortez. A lot of people did. Imagine it's 2011 and you're both students at Boston University, a not quite prestigious but highly expensive school for kids who couldn't get into Tufts. You know who Sandy Cortez is because 3 days a week at 12:20 you see her in your philosophy of gender and sexuality class. She's always there in the front row snapping her gum. And then like clockwork, she never misses your queer theory seminar, which meets every Thursday at 3:30 p.m. because if there's one thing about queer theory scholars, they're not early risers. Sandy goes to both and she talks a lot in both classes. She jumps into the conversation whenever she feels she has something important to say, which is frequently. She's hardly a genius, but she is highly self-assured. She's got strong opinions about racism and cosmetics. She seems to spend a lot of time updating her Facebook page. Those are the main things that you remember about Sandy Cortez. Now, fast forward 10 years. Suddenly, Sandy Cortez is a world-famous figure. Somehow, she's calling herself Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, some kind of female Che, Westchester County's first socialist revolutionary. And she's still yammering on about racism and eyeshadow, her twin obsessions. And she's still frantically updating her social media pages. Some things have not changed. But other things have changed. One night, you're watching TV and you see Sandy Cortez talking authoritatively about America's energy grid, like she knows a lot about it, and that stops you in your tracks. Wait a second. The energy grid? That's an adult thing, right? That's not queer theory. That's real. That's a very complicated piece of infrastructure. Even a lot of engineers don't really understand how the energy grid works. How could Sandy Cortez possibly know anything about that? She can't drive a standard transmission. She can't program a coffee maker. She doesn't even make her own bed in the morning. The energy grid? Please. It seems preposterous. So you grab a beer and you settle in to watch her talk about it. And your jaw hangs open as you do. Here's what you see.
We know that there is no such thing as cheap energy because the price of cheap energy has always been our lives.
The trampling of indigenous rights is a cause of climate change. The trampling of racial justice is a cause of climate change. We're like, the world is going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change. And your biggest issue is how are we going to pay for it? And like, this is the war. This is our World War II. The fossil fuel industry and the future of humanity are fundamentally incompatible. They just are. I mean, that's not a political opinion. That is the science. We continue to burn fossil fuels, our planet will become inhabitable.
Really? Energy, huh? How's energy generated, do you know? What's a watt? What's amperage? Speak slowly. We've got time. But she doesn't. Instead, she goes, the fossil fuel industry and the future of humanity are fundamentally incompatible. They just are. I mean, that's not a political opinion. That's the science. Of course it is. That's the science. Whatever I say is the science. There's no debate here. Obey. But that's not how democracy works. Thank God. You actually have to convince people. And so she tried. She introduced the Green New Deal 3 years ago. And it didn't go far. In fact, it went nowhere. In fact, virtually nobody in Congress supported it. In fact, when it came time for a vote on the Green New Deal, even her co-sponsor, the other guy who wrote it, the super woke senator from Massachusetts, voted present, not in favor. Now, why is that? Why did nobody actually support it? Well, because if you think cow flatulence is even in the top 200 top issues for most Americans, you're Sandy Cortez. Go back to queer theory class. Get rid of fossil fuels? Yeah, what then? Well, starvation, poverty, societal collapse. Voters, it turns out, are not into any of those things. And so nothing that resembles the Green New Deal is going to pass the United States Congress in our lifetimes, provided this remains an actual democracy, which is to say, provided the public has anything to say about how they're governed. So that's a non-starter here. It's never going to happen by democratic means. But that doesn't mean it can't happen. It doesn't mean that ideologues can't impose the Green New Deal on weaker countries that are too poor to refuse it. And over the past several years, that's exactly what they've done. So the Green New Deal has actually taken effect around the world. So we don't have to guess about what would happen if it took effect here. We can know. That's science. Let's start with Ghana. Ghana's a pretty little country, peaceful place, actually, on the west coast of Africa. 3 years ago, Ghana was in great shape. It had one of the fastest growing economies in the world. In fact, it had so much energy over most of the last decade, it was exporting it to its neighbors in West Africa. Now, those energy exports from Ghana peaked in 2014. Why that year? Well, because the next year, the World Bank published this headline on its website, quote, World Bank approves largest ever guarantees for Ghana's energy transformation. Oh, when they promise to transform your energy, slow down. But Ghana didn't slow down. They just kept going. The World Bank promised to provide, and we're quoting, technical assistance for energy sector reforms and the drafting of a new renewable energy law. So in return for all this help, Ghana agreed to limit its carbon emissions, and then they entered the Paris Climate Agreement. Oh, how virtuous. What happened next? This is the part you don't read that much about. Last year, Ghana experienced a complete shutdown of its national power supply. Oh, no more electricity! No emissions because we have no electricity. And blackouts have continued since then. Just yesterday, a news source in Ghana reported that, quote, residents in parts of the Ashanti region who have been hit with power cuts are without water as well. Because it turns out you need electricity to provide water, also to grow food. Now, this is not a small thing. The Ashanti region has millions of people living in it. They're all now living in the Stone Age. And it's not just the energy grid that's now compromised in Ghana. International observers say the country is now facing severe food shortages and hunger, starvation within a matter of months. Why is that? It's a fertile country, hardworking people. Well, now they're running out of fertilizer. Why? Well, because for years, Sandy Cortez's friends in the NGO community pushed Ghana toward less efficient, more expensive organic fertilizers. And the government of Ghana, because it's not a rich government, caved. Last year, according to Ghana's news service, Ghana's agricultural minister, quote, urged local farmers to adopt an organic agriculture system to reduce the impact of climate change. Oh, what happened then? Well, the good people of Ghana, while they feel good about their fight against climate change, are now starving. And in June, last month, police in Ghana used water and tear gas to attack hundreds of demonstrators in Accra, which is the capital of Ghana. Now, it's not just Ghana. The same thing just happened in Sri Lanka. In 2016, the World Economic Forum published an article by a Columbia professor called Joseph Stiglitz, one of the dumbest people on planet Earth, urging Ghana to transition to, quote, high productivity organic farming. Now, what does Stiglitz know about farming? Ever farmed? No. But he felt strongly that Sri Lanka should try a new kind of farming, and of course sold it to Sri Lankans as a pathway to prosperity. In 2015, the World Economic Forum published an article on its website entitled, and we're quoting, "This is how we will make Sri Lanka rich by 2025. You can search for that article, but it's gone now, along with the government of Sri Lanka. So they had an actual insurrection, not January 6th, not a guy in horns and a bearskin running around on mushrooms making weird noises. No, an actual insurrection, where they like come to your house and swim in your swimming pool, root through your sock drawer and make you leave. That's what they did to the people who run Sri Lanka, they being the public. The turning point came in 2021 when the president of Sri Lanka, acting on advice from the World Economic Forum, banned the use and importation of chemical fertilizers. Now, the problem was virtually every farm in Sri Lanka used those fertilizers to produce food, which it turns out people need every day in order to survive. As a result of that move, food prices in Sri Lanka nearly doubled. Millions more Sri Lankans now live in poverty, which is not a joke. And because the economy has collapsed, Sri Lanka now cannot afford fuel imports. So Sri Lankans are now waiting days for gasoline. Watch.
36-year-old Thuvan, an auto rickshaw driver, has spent 2 nights at this gas station in central Colombo. It's been an endless wait to refuel his 3-wheeler. Petrol pumps are all but dry across the city.
At every petrol station we go to, they tell us they have run out of gas.
With no fuel, Thuvan has been out of work. He leaves his rickshaw in the care of friends and heads home to meet family, where the situation is equally dire. There's been a crippling shortage of cooking gas across the island nation. Thuvan's wife Fatima has been cooking on a kerosene stove for the last 3 months.
I only have this 1 bottle of kerosene left. It'll finish after I heat the food tonight.
What's so interesting is millions of people are now really suffering. The government just fell in Sri Lanka. Now, no one in Sri Lanka is white. They're all what our Democratic Party would call people of color. And yet the American intellectuals who pushed that disaster in Sri Lanka, who are responsible for the suffering there, have escaped all culpability. No one is saying a word about it. Meanwhile, a cop in Minneapolis was rough with a convicted felon 2 years ago, and we have to stop everything and send him to prison for life. But Joseph Stiglitz is totally fine. And it's not just happening, by the way, in the third world. It's happening even in rich countries. The Netherlands, for example, which is a very rich country, the second biggest food exporter in the world, tried to do, for reasons that are not clear, but may have to do with Western guilt, the same thing that leaders in Sri Lanka tried to do. They just ordered farmers to cut virtually all of their nitrogen oxide emissions to, quote, save the environment. Now, doing that would shutter most farms in the Netherlands and destroy the country's food supply. And once again, that led to riots. So everything that's happened in Sri Lanka, in Ghana, and the Netherlands is happening at the behest, not simply of ideologues, but of some of the largest financial institutions in the world. They want more of this. It's why Ghana has achieved a near perfect ESG environmental impact score of 97.7. According to World Economic Research, Sri Lanka has an ESG score of 98.1. The Netherlands, 90.7. So the poorer you get, the more human suffering there is, the higher your ESG score. And that's important because companies will not invest unless you have a high ESG score. Interesting. So these countries have no choice. And that's why South Africa, for example, worked so hard to get an ESG score that now totals 91. Now, that effort began in 2015 when South Africa switched to renewables. Now, how did that work? Well, like everything in South Africa, no one in America really wants to know. It's their favorite country. It's a huge success. What's life like in South Africa for people of all colors? Stop. Well, The Guardian, of all places, reported at the time, when we're quoting, solar, biomass, and wind energy systems are popping up all over the country and feeding the clean energy into the strained electrical grid. So their grid's been falling apart since 1994, but no problem. The green energy geniuses are going to save South Africa. How'd that work? Well, 7 years later, the Washington Post reported that South Africa regularly experiences, quote, rolling blackouts that last 8 hours or more, crippling economic activity and disrupting life in this nation of 60 million people. And that's true. Ask anyone who lives there. It's falling apart. It doesn't work. Also true in France. France is committed to renewable energy. How's that working? Well, France currently has an ESG environmental score of 92.6. Why? Because 10 years ago, France pledged to derive a quarter of all of its energy from renewables. In 2018, these policies led to riots. Remember the so-called Yellow Jackets? People didn't like it. If you cared about democracy, you would listen to them, but no one in charge actually does, so they don't. And things have gotten worse since then. This past June, the heads of 3 French energy companies called on the public to, quote, immediately reduce consumption of fuel, oil, electricity, and gas amid shortages and soaring prices. Oh, stop civilization. It doesn't work. That same month, France's president publicly begged Joe Biden to start producing more oil because the Saudis cannot make enough to supply Europe. Watch.
One, I'm at the next claims, and my commitment. Second, according to us, the Saudis can increase a little bit, but 150 or a little bit more. They don't have huge capacities. And this is before 6 months time.
So only the Europeans have been dumb enough to embrace this. Unlike Ghana, they could afford not to, but they are anyway, out of some weird sense of collective guilt. So it's happening throughout Europe. In the UK, ESG score of 92.7, the National Infrastructure Commission has warned that as many as 6 million households could face power cuts this summer. Sound like the first world? No, it doesn't. That's England now. In Germany, ESG score 90.2, the government is now rationing hot water due to an ongoing gas crisis. Officials in Hamburg, Germany's second largest city, just warned that, quote, warm water could only be made available at certain times of the day in an emergency. Now, just a few years ago, the Germany's government laughed at warnings from Donald Trump that this would happen. It's on video. Oh, they are so stupid, you have no idea. Green energy is the future. Every place it's been tried has fallen apart. Every single one, with no exceptions. Albania, Kenya, Argentina, Peru, Ecuador, Panama, Libya, so on. But it's not just a problem there, it's becoming a problem here. So in the United States, our ESG score on environmental issues currently stands at 58. But Joe Biden, who buys into every stupid trend, wants to change that. It's very important to get our ESG score up because we want to be more like Ghana. So at the very moment that Biden is sending our strategic petroleum reserve, which we own, he doesn't, to his son's business partners in China, he is vowing to end fossil fuels in this country and boost our ESG score. Watch.
Would there be any place for fossil fuels, including coal and fracking, in a Biden administration?
No, we would work it out. We would make sure it's eliminated and no more subsidies for either one of those. Any fossil fuel. No more subsidies for fossil fuel industry. No more drilling on federal lands. No more
work
drilling,
it out.
including offshore.
We'd work
no
it out.
ability
What
for
does that
the oil
mean?
industry to continue to drill, period. But I want you to look in my eyes. I guarantee you, we're going to end fossil fuel, and I am not going to cooperate with you.
Oh boy, that's wonderful.
So let's just be really clear. Fossil fuels aren't just not bad. Fossil fuels aren't just a net good. Fossil fuels are the only thing that stands between the United States becoming Ghana. Fossil fuels are the only thing that make the United States a rich country and not a poor country. We have the largest recoverable oil reserves in the world. If we can't tap those, we will be Ghana. We will be poor. But Joe Biden doesn't care. And so he is clamping down on our ability to extract them. And like the leaders of every other country, driven into the ground by green energy schemes thought up by morons like Sandy Cortez, he's taking no responsibility for the damage he has caused.
Look, we need more refining capacity. This idea that they don't have oil to drill and to bring up is simply not true. This piece of the Republicans talking about Biden shut down fields, wrong. 9,000 of them, okay? So then we ought to be able to work something out whereby they're able to increase refining capacity and still not give up on transitioning to renewable energy.
Problem is, he doesn't know anything about refining or extracting or how the grid works or anything about anything because he's never had a real job. He's worked for the federal government since he was in his 20s.
Just work it out.
None of these people have any experience doing anything. Again, most of them can't drive a manual transmission. So to get a lecture on the power grid or energy from people who have no idea what it is a bit much. And the topic is too important to continue to listen to their nonsense as we become poorer. And by the way, as the rifts just beneath the surface in American society are exacerbated by that poverty. As GDP drops, societal tension rises. It's dangerous. Back off. And it's accelerated. In the past year, the United States has experienced blackouts in some of our biggest states. Why? Because they're relying more and more on renewables. Places like California and even Texas. Just yesterday, in order to avoid a blackout, the largest grid operator in the state of Texas begged residents to turn up their thermostats, no more AC for you, and asked them not to use any major appliances. Really, in Texas, which has the largest oil and gas reserves in the continental United States. What are they doing in Texas? But across the country, this is true. Orlando, Florida recently experimented with fertilizer bans to, quote, curb pollution. So the World Economic Forum wants a lot more of this. They just released a position paper calling for countries to, quote, agree to end the underpricing of fossil fuels, which is the principal factor preventing a clean energy transition. In other words, it's too cheap. It works too well. Gas needs to be higher so you won't be able to use it. So you'll have to be poor. And they're saying this as we're watching countries around the world, we can give you more detail, you see the point, are collapsing and entering into a state of revolution because these morons tampered with their energy grids. But they don't care. They're going to continue doing it unless someone stops them until exactly the same thing happens here. That's true. Mark Morano knows it's true. He's the author of The Great Reset, Global Elites and the Permanent Lockdown. He joins us now. So Mark, you've been working on this for years. You've written a lot about it. But now watching the public enter the homes of the people who run Sri Lanka and swim in their pools, you'd think the World Economic Forum and Biden would say, wait a second, we don't want revolution. We've got to pull back a little bit. But they're not. They're not learning anything. Why?
They're not learning anything because this is such a deep-set ideology. If you go back about 2007, the UN came out with a report, an agricultural report, warning that farmland was creating more, dangerous heat-trapping gases in the entire transportation sector. They've been at a war on agriculture for decades, and their goal is to literally get us to eat insects and this lab-grown fake meat. And one of the ways they're achieving that is by collapsing the current farming. Netherlands is a model success of farming, but because of the net zero goals of Europe and its country, they're going to now have to start shutting down. And these are family-run generational farms. They're going to be replaced. Either they're going to be used for some other purpose, or they're going to be replaced with equity asset firms, people like Bill Gates, or even China buying up this land, and they will play the game of the net zero emissions. And that's what's happening around the world. I call it the sort of the defund the police moment, where in less than 2 years, defund the police, people could see the results, see the collapse of cities and crime. We had Joe Biden saying it's time to fund the police less than 2 years after the movement began. Kamala Harris applause, Nancy Pelosi applause. I think green energy and this whole war on the agriculture is now, the voters cannot support this anymore. We're seeing what's happening in Sri Lanka. We're seeing what's happening in the Netherlands. There's protests in other countries growing. Canada's following the same line with fertilizer. This is a war against modern civilization. Make no mistake about it, Tucker.
And it's a war against people. Life expectancy will drop to the floor if we tamper with fossil fuels. They're our greatest blessing. But I just got to ask,
yes.
If I started lecturing anybody on heart surgery, here's how you do a stent. They would say, you don't know anything about it. You've never performed a heart surgery. How do we allow people like Cortez and Biden, who don't know what a carburetor is, to lecture us about something as complex as energy policy? This is insane.
Well, it's because people like the World Economic Forum, this is their stated goal. John Kerry can go to the CEOs of major corporations and get them to sign a climate pledge, which then commits them to all these green goals. So this is all happening behind the scenes. That's why they love places like Davos. There's no lobbying rules. Corporations can meet with politicians behind the scenes, and this is what they do. It's about how they can make money. They believe that us, the unwashed masses, if left to our own devices, will create inequity, racism, environmental destruction, a climate crisis. So they literally want to regulate not just our farming, but every aspect of our lives. And that's really what the World Economic Forum and the United Nations is after here, is controlling humans.
Man, they're playing with fire. And they will get actual revolutions if they mess with that. Actually, that is true. Mark Brown, I appreciate your coming on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tucker. Appreciate it.
So if Sandy Cortez can be an expert on the energy grid, then Joe Biden can be a doctor. Dr. Jill. Problem is, like Sandy Cortez, Joe Biden sometimes goes outside and talks in public. Now, her adopted son described her as a vindictive moron. Is that true? Well, we did an investigation on that. Joe Biden, vindictive moron, ? And the results we'll have for you next. So Hunter Biden's text messages and emails and videos are all out there on the internet for the world to see, and that is a pretty major invasion of privacy. We will concede that. How would you like your text messages to get out there in public? On the other hand, they probably wouldn't be quite as interesting as Hunter Biden's. And on balance, we're glad to see them because we're learning a lot about the Biden family's business arrangements with China, and they are extensive. But we're also learning about what the Biden family is like, and boy, are they repulsive. We learned, among other things, what Hunter Biden thinks of the family matriarch, and that would, of course, be America's doctor, Dr. Jill. Now, The Sun is reporting that in one text message, Hunter Biden once described his stepmother, that would be the First Lady of the United States, as, we're quoting now, a vindictive moron. He also called her the bad word, which we can't use on TV, but it's the bad one we can't use even at home. Use that word. But what about vindictive moron? Is that true? Well, we did a little research, and it turns out, yeah, it's true. She's a vindictive moron. Now, we know she's a moron because we read her doctoral thesis. And that proves, among other things, that she can't do simple math. And if you don't believe that, here's one example. And we're quoting. 3/4 of the class will be Caucasian, 1/4 of the class will be African American, 1 seat will hold a Latino, and the remaining seats will be filled with students of Asian descent or non-resident aliens. How many percentage points is that? Now, later on in the thesis, a doctoral thesis, why she's Dr. Jill, she miscalculates private and public sector school enrollment by more than, 200 percentage points. Now, you might be tempted to dismiss all of that. Maybe she wrote her thesis in 10 minutes in the subway, knowing that no one at the University of Delaware would dare correct it. Of course, they didn't. And that would explain the hundreds of typos in her thesis. But you don't need to believe her thesis to know that Dr. Jill is, in fact, in the words of Hunter Biden himself, her son, a moron, because we have videos of her speaking. Here was Dr. Jill yesterday at something called the Latinx Inclusion Luncheon in San Antonio, Texas.
Raul helped build this organization with the understanding that the diversity of this community, as distinct as the Boca as beautiful as the blossoms of Miami, and as unique as the breakfast tacos here in San Antonio, is your strength.
Yes, I'm not patronizing you Latinx people, but you're all tacos. Just all tacos. That's what the First Lady said. Now, the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, which presumably supports the Biden administration, decided they had to explain some things very slowly to Dr. Jill. Among others, they said this, quote, using breakfast tacos to try and demonstrate the uniqueness of Latinos demonstrates a lack of cultural knowledge. We are not tacos. We are not tacos. Okay. So Jill Biden realized, whoa, maybe we shouldn't call them tacos. So her press secretary, her publicist, put out a statement doing a little damage control. Quote, the First Lady apologizes that her words conveyed anything but pure admiration and love for the Latino community. Wait a second, Jill Biden, Dr. Jill. The Latino community? What happened to the Latinx community? Was that the whole point of the luncheon, to tell Latinos that actually they're Latinx? Degender your language, sexist Latinos. Well, the truth is, for a long time, connecting with the Latinx community has strained every ounce of intellect that Jill Biden has to offer, which is limited, as we noted. Here was Jill Biden a year ago speaking to union workers in California. This is one of the greatest moments ever caught on camera, so pause, turn the volume up on your set, and enjoy.
Anything is possible. So say it with me. Si se puede.
Si se padres, padres, or something. As Cesar Chavez used to say, si se padres. He couldn't speak Spanish either. Don't you worry. So Dr. Jill's a moron. Hunter Biden was absolutely right. But is she vindictive too? That's the outstanding question. Hunter called her a vindictive moron. Moron, yes. Vindictive, jury's still out. Well, now, we know. A few days ago, Jill Biden wrote on Twitter that women, quote, have the right to make our own decisions about our bodies. Of course, not with the vax, but with abortion. So reading this, retired Lieutenant General Gary Volesky, a former Army spokesman who mentors soldiers, responded this way, quote, glad to see you finally know what a woman is. Well, guess what happened to General Volesky? He got suspended. Now he's being investigated by the U.S. Army, which has no problem with China, but they're very concerned that someone might criticize Dr. Jill. So Hunter Biden was right, and we're just going to say it out loud. Hunter Biden was right about Dr. Jill. Vindictive moron. So Black Rifle Coffee was founded not simply to make the best coffee in the country, which it probably does, but to, we're quoting, serve coffee and culture to people who love America. And they actually did that. We didn't know what to think of Black Rifle Coffee, then we spent a full day with its founder, and we were impressed. We'll bring you the conversation next. So a few years back, Starbucks, which makes awful coffee in case you haven't noticed, pledged to hire 10,000 refugees from all over the world, so you wouldn't think about how burnt their coffee is. Now, in response to that, a little-known company called Black Rifle Coffee made its own pledge. They vowed to hire 10,000 veterans. Now, the man behind that decision is called Evan Haffer. He's a former Green Beret who founded Black Rifle Coffee. He's now its CEO. Now, we've heard a lot about him, didn't quite know what to think of him at all. So we spent a day with him, ate with him, shot with him, and then interviewed him for Tucker Carlson today. And we were definitely impressed. Here's Evan Haffer explaining how he and why he started his company.
So I started roasting coffee to take with me. I was in Kirkuk, Iraq, which was a relatively small city up in northern Iraq. Yep. There's just outside of Sulaymaniyah and Erbil. I was in Kirkuk, and I'd spent about a year and a half up there, going back and forth into Kirkuk and Tikrit. My problem was, and I had this problem, which is I couldn't get fresh coffee, and what I wanted was to figure out how I could get fresh coffee into Kirkuk. I did a little bit of research in my, I guess my economics that I was crunching at the time was like, well, if I buy a 1 pound roaster, I can go home and then I'll start roasting coffee to take back with me to Kirkuk or wherever I was going. So I'd go home, I'd buy this roaster, and I start roasting coffee 1 pound at a time throughout that year. And I'd roast like 30 or 40 pounds, and I'd take it back out to Iraq with me. I'd load up 1 kit bag full of my gear and like one kit bag full of coffee. And
does anyone call you names for doing this? Because that's a little eccentric. I mean, I'm
it's super. Yeah, it's like super eccentric. And yes, it was like most of which I can't repeat. But yeah, the guys, you know, there was a constant amount of ribbing until they drank the coffee, and then it was like, where's Evan going? Because I want to go out there because I know he's going to have great coffee, right? So then you'd have guys that were deploying specifically to different cities, knowing like, I know Evan's going to be in Basra, I'm going to go to Basra because he's going to have great coffee down there.
So if you run a coffee company, you should be completely dementedly obsessed with coffee, and he is. Great coffee, great guy. That's all, the whole interview. Tucker Carlson today, tomorrow, 7 a.m. on Fox Nation. So in March of last year, Joe Biden ordered all 600 federal agencies to, quote, expand citizens' opportunities to register to vote and obtain information about and participate in the electoral process. Agencies had 200 days to file their plans, and they have done so, but the Biden administration is keeping those plans secret. They've refused to respond to congressional inquiries on the topic. Now, why is that? No good reason. Molly Hemingway, almost alone, has been looking into this. She's the editor-in-chief of The Federalist, also authored the book Rigged, How the Media, Big Tech, and the Democrats Seized Our Elections, which they have. She joins us tonight. Molly, you wrote a great piece on this, which I hope that our audience will read. But summarize for us, if you would, what this is about. What's going on?
Yeah, so just as you said, President Biden issued an executive order telling all 600 federal agencies to submit plans about how they could engage in a federal takeover of elections. You might remember that when Democrats took control of the Senate and the White House, they had their signature legislation was a federal takeover of election administration. Now, they failed to do that. This appears to be something of a backup plan where they can get involved in all sorts of election-related activities using the bureaucracy. And there are so many problems with this. I mean, first and foremost, it's unconstitutional. The Constitution is very clear that it is given to state legislatures to handle election administration in their states. It's also really unethical. I mean, you noted that people are desperately trying to find out exactly what these plans are, and they're not being given details, but details are starting to come out. And it appears that at that point where government benefits meet with the people, they are taking advantage of that opportunity, you know, whether it's a homeless shelter or whether it's food distribution programs or health programs as a way to do this federal overtaking of election administration. And it also is a recipe for chaos and confusion. Each state has different laws, and the idea that federal bureaucrats who don't even necessarily do a great job with what they're supposed to be doing could manage all those intricacies is, it's delusional. And it's just a very disruptive thing to our system at a time when the entire country needs to have confidence and belief that the elections are secure.
Yeah. So they did the same with equity. They screamed racism louder. Elderly white people screamed about racism until they were allowed to control our elections. And Republicans gave them. Same story every time. And I appreciate your covering this almost alone. Molly Hemingway.
I do want to say really quickly, there are people who are working very hard to get this information. They have filed lawsuits. Freedom of Information Act resets. Russ Vought of the Center for Renewing America has put in like 9 lawsuits. So hopefully something will happen from those.
You gotta hope so. It's important. Molly Hemingway of the Federalist. Thanks a lot. So new video shows exactly what law enforcement in Uvalde, Texas was doing as a gunman murdered children in a nearby classroom. We almost don't want to show this to you because it's so awful, but you should know. So we will next. So leaders of both parties have been talking about the mass shooting at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde since it happened 2 months ago. And they're using that tragedy as a pretext to take your guns away as a law-abiding person. But they've ignored what happened in Uvalde at the school. And they've especially ignored the failure of police on the scene to prevent the shooting. Now, outside the school, officers prevented parents from saving their own children. This went on for roughly an hour. Now we know that police were what they were doing inside the school. Trace Gallagher has that video for us tonight. Hey, Trace.
Tucker, the entire video is 77 minutes. It was obtained by KVUE-TV and the Austin American-Statesman, who cut it to 4 minutes and removed some sound. But the context remains very much the same, meaning that for more than an hour, heavily armed police officers stood in a school hallway during an active shooting and did nothing. Here's the timeline. 11:33 a.m., the gunman enters the school through a propped open door and starts shooting into rooms 111 and 112. 2 minutes later, police enter through the same propped open door. 3 officers go toward the classroom, but when the gunman opens fire, they retreat to where the other officers are positioned. Watch. And And by now, there are 19 officers on campus. Now, at the same time, a girl calls 911 and whispers that she's in room 112. Over the next 20 minutes, she calls back 4 more times, telling dispatchers that multiple children are dead, some are alive, and that she desperately needs help. She got nothing. At 12:15, SWAT team members arrive on campus, but still do not enter the classrooms. 47 minutes after the shooting began, an officer walks over, gets hand sanitizer, and goes back to his waiting position. It took 1 hour, 17 minutes before Border Patrol agents finally breached the door, entered the class, and killed the gunman. Tucker.
That's just such an awful story. Trace Gallagher, thanks so much.
You bet.
Using hand sanitizer. We've defended the police and will continue to defend the police. They're essential. Most of them are good people. But you can't lie about what actually happened as a pretext to taking guns away from law-abiding Americans in the middle of a crime epidemic. That's what they're doing, because they're liars. So since Roe v. Wade was overturned by the Supreme Court, you've heard a lot about ectopic pregnancies. Excuse me. That's when a fertilized egg implants outside the uterus, and that could be a huge emergency, a life-threatening emergency. Now, Democrats are not pretending that women with ectopic pregnancies are no longer able to receive medical care. Sandy Cortez in Westchester is one of those. She has mocked Brett Kavanaugh and his family for being harassed at dinner because Brett Kavanaugh somehow, who has children unlike her, does not care about ectopic pregnancies. Quote, poor guy. He left before a souffle because he decided half the country should risk death if they have an ectopic pregnancy within the wrong state lines. Now, first of all, she's encouraging violence, as she has done before, which is unacceptable, particularly for an elected official, period. For another, it's a lie. No state considers treatment for ectopic pregnancies to be abortion, and no state ever will. So what does it tell us that politicians are lying about this? Can you imagine? And why did the Biden administration, speaking of lying, just repeat a story about a 10-year-old child who got pregnant and then got an abortion or was not allowed to get an abortion when it turns out the story was not true? And by the way, when a 10-year-old gets pregnant, the first question is not, how do we get rid of the kid? The first question is, where's the rapist? Where's the rapist? Allison Centofonte is a pro-life advocate who's watched all of this happen, and she joins us tonight. Allison, thanks so much for coming on. So first to the question of ectopic pregnancies, which is a tragedy and is a legitimately scary thing and not that uncommon. Democrats are saying that these are somehow treatment for this medical emergency is illegal in places because of Roe v. Wade falling. Is that true?
No. Listen, there are so many lies floating around the internet right now, and it's so sad to see our world leaders, our national leaders like Joe Biden himself, Kamala Harris, and others repeat the lie that I believe they know is a blatant lie. There is no pro-lifer, no pro-life legislation that seeks to limit women's ability to treat an ectopic pregnancy or a miscarriage. You know that. And you know that if anyone did try and limit a woman's access to that care, we, the pro-life movement, would be the first to speak out against it. There is a big difference legally and medically between ectopic pregnancy, miscarriage management, and abortion. No woman, Tucker, chooses an ectopic pregnancy or a miscarriage. We're here to defend children. We're talking about an abortion, which is a choice to intentionally destroy an innocent human life.
That's exactly right. And you do wish people would push back harder. And by the way, if they can't have an honest conversation about it, then maybe they don't have pure motives. I guess I would conclude. Allison Centofonte, I appreciate your clarity on that. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
So we're learning a ton from the massive data drop from Hunter Biden's electronic devices, including the fact that Joe Biden's family refers to him by a nickname that's, well, we don't quite know what to say about it, but we have some idea why they call him this. We'll tell you what they call him and why next. So a lot of people online are wondering why, according to Hunter Biden's electronic devices, Joe Biden's family refers to him as Pedo Peter. It's kind of weird. Why would they call a guy who showers with his own daughter Pedo Peter? We have no idea. Then we saw these pictures. They showed Joe Biden kissing his own granddaughter on the lips multiple times. In February of 2020, Joe Biden was speaking at a campaign event in Iowa. He said his daughter told him not to kiss her in public. Then he said his granddaughter is, quote, different.
But granddaughters not only love their dads, their grandpops, they always like them, and that's the great thing. Thank you, baby. Thanks.
Yeah, so it's totally normal. Sharing with your daughter is totally normal. But there is a reason the FBI wants to get its hands on Joe Biden's daughter's diary very badly. It's willing to arrest people in order to keep that from becoming public. We'll let you continue to guess. That's it for us tonight. Before we go, though, sad news. The Democratic Party's future, the twerking queen, Tiara Mack, state senator from Rhode Island, looks like she was banned from TikTok earlier today. Apparently, the Chinese are interfering in the Democratic Party's internal affairs. They don't like her twerking. They're pretty uptight, old Xi Jinping. We're going to investigate exactly what happened. Of course, bring it to you tomorrow night, 8 p.m. But in the meantime, Sean Hannity takes over live. Hey,
How do I pick up from twerking?